Welcome to Musings at the Space.Inc., a Bangla Life initiative. Today we have with us Professor Johan Höglund, a professor of English at Linnaeus University and Director of the Centre of Concurrences in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies at Linnaeus University, Sweden. Dr. Höglund has published extensively on the relationship between imperialism and popular culture in a number of different contexts, including the late Victorian era, the long history of US global expansion and decline, and the often unrecognized era of Nordic colonialism. He's the author of the American Imperial Gothic, Popular Culture, Empire Violence 2014, and the co-editor of several scholarly collections and special issues, including Nordic Colonialisms for Scandinavian Studies 2019, Revisiting Adventure for Journal of Popular Culture 2018, Gothic in the Anthropocene, forthcoming from University of Minnesota Press 2021, and several other collections. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know that you have written elsewhere about the pandemic, and as we wade through a global crisis for almost 4 months, tell us how you understand the pandemic and crisis as two separate concepts, and what's at stake in such distinctions.
There was an effort when the pandemic got going, especially in Europe in late February, early March, to think of the pandemic as some kind of equalizer that would obliterate differences rather than create differences. And those claims have been made in scholarship and also by governments that now we're equal before this pandemic because the virus doesn't recognize differences in gender, in age, in race, in class. We're all the same before the virus. That turned out actually to be wrong because the virus is much more severe for the elderly. It also tends to kill more men than women. But if you look at the pandemic, the group that's going to suffer the most are elderly men. And I think that even though, of course, we need to protect that category of people as well, it's also a very diverse group, obviously. But we need to think about what's going on in society in its entirety and how this pandemic is accelerating, but not creating, but certainly accelerating a number of already existing crises. And that most of the suffering that emerges out of this period, out of this event, is going to be related to those crises rather than to the pandemic as a virus. And I'm thinking we can isolate a few such crises, and one is certainly the economic crisis, where the Oxfam recently published a study that predicted that about 500 million people are going to be thrown into poverty because of this. And that group is unlikely to be the already affluent, the already privileged. It's going to be those, if we think about this in terms of class, it's going to be the people who are already vulnerable, but sometimes termed the precariat, those who live according to the gig economy. And we're looking at this globally. This will happen obviously because most people who live on the edge, most people who live precarious lives live in the global south, but we see that also happening in the global north. This is not simply an issue between the global north and the global south. It's more complex than that. And so that is certainly a crisis that was already going on, it was already happening. We see the same thing in terms of gender, and this is a very intersectional crisis that we're looking at. Women, again, tend to command less money than men. So of course, if this is a crisis in terms of the economy, women are likely to suffer more than men generally, and children as well. Children that's a group that doesn't really suffer much from the pandemic, from the virus, but when it comes to poverty, they will suffer severely. They will be deprived of schooling, they will be deprived of healthcare, they will be deprived of good food and so on. When we think about gender, one thing that is happening right now is that people are locked down. This is opening up in many places. In some places, it's still happening. The lockdown brings families together. This can be a good thing, but in places or in families where domestic violence is an issue, of course, there's more opportunities for that. There's more stress on those families. So we see globally a rise in domestic violence, and that violence is directed mostly against women and against children, not so much against men. Even among the privileged, so to speak, those who have permanent jobs employed in the academy, we can see a gender difference. A study from the UK recently showed that women publish less during this pandemic, while men publish more research. I think that's really interesting. And it suggests that women have to do most of the work in the home now that children are home from school. So that kind of inequality is also important to consider. Then, if we think about this as a crisis of equality, of course, race also comes into this. Poverty is more more common among people of color, more common in the global south, and we can also see in the global north how racism becomes more and more of an issue. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement was re-energized during this particular crisis or during the pandemic. It has to do with police brutality, certainly, but also has to do with the fact that for a long period of time, Black lives have been considered as grievable, as Judith Butler phrases it. And of course, when you have a pandemic where people are actually dying and where people of color are more vulnerable to the virus because of the fact that they don't have access to healthcare to the same extent, then that situation becomes, even more extreme, even more difficult to tolerate. So a number of different crises here that need to be considered. We can also talk about the environmental crisis, we can talk about the political crisis, and we can talk about the information crisis. So a number of crises that we need to think about that were already happening, but that have been accelerated and energized by the pandemic.
I'm thinking of, as a person who works in the humanities, and I know that you are a professor of English in the humanities also, what do you think is the role of humanities during this kind of an uncertain time when almost everyone is suffering in some degree of wearing ways? So what is the role of humanities in our times right now?
I think that's a really important, in fact, an absolutely crucial question, a question that needs to be posed also to those who fund research globally. There's a tremendous effort right now at sponsoring, funding medical research, and that's understandable. People in the humanities are unlikely to figure out how to construct a vaccine that can end this particular pandemic, or to find other forms of other types of cures or ways to relieve patients from physical symptoms. But again, the crises that have been energized by the pandemic, medical science is not really geared towards addressing those, and they are likely to create more suffering than the pandemic, even though the pandemic is what has energized them. It's not, they were already going on. And I think in the humanities, what we can do, along with the social sciences, is to think precisely about those crises. Post-colonial scholarship, decolonial scholarship, other scholarship geared towards thinking about social justice, about class, about race, about gender, is more important now than it was before the pandemic, just because the questions, the issues that this pandemic is raising and that this crisis is creating have become even more acute, even more important to think about, especially as we hopefully move towards a resolution of the pandemic. But what society look like when we emerge out of this crisis? And again, there's a number of scholars in postcolonial studies who've thought about this before. When we talk about moving out of the pandemic, the desire seems to be to get back to some kind of status quo, where we can live in the way that we did before. But as we know, if we're interested in questions of global justice, that was not a just world. It was a world that was already at that point breaking apart for many different reasons, because of the lack of economic justice, of epistemological justice, but also because of the climate crisis that was getting worse and worse, and that's still getting worse and worse. What is it that we want to get back to? We don't want to get back to the world that we lived in before the pandemic. Actually, we need to get back to something else, something that works, that's more resilient. And the humanities and social sciences are those sciences that can think and talk about those precise issues.
Thank you. I'm thinking of this book from 2008, Contagious Cultures Carriers, the Outbreak Narrative by Priscilla Wald, where she talks about a contagion outbreak narrative that spreads information that can stigmatize people, groups, communities, and those can have large consequences. And Wald argues about the need to rethink ideas of disease emergence and social interaction. As we move through our current coronavirus situation, it has shown how xenophobia has been on the rise as China is now, it becomes the other, the source of the disease. How can we rethink an outbreak narrative when it comes to COVID-19 so that it fosters better human interaction?
That's also a really interesting question, and Wald's book, I think, is a very important read at the moment. Let's begin by just thinking a bit about where where xenophobia comes from, and why that is one widespread type of xenophobia at the moment. If we think about some of the nations that have been in the spotlight during this spring, we can think about nations like the US, Brazil, India also, nations ruled by populist governments who've spent a lot of time deregulating the state, privatizing healthcare, taking the social welfare system apart. The UK, I think, can be added to that list as well, and a few other countries. Of course, there are differences between them. But we think about that particular move. When you're in that situation, especially Trump is, how do you resolve that? How do you explain the fact that your nation is falling apart? But the only way forward for you is to find a scapegoat. And for Trump, China has become that scapegoat. He has insisted several times to call the COVID virus the Chinese virus, just to encourage that and to put the blame for the collapse of the US response to the pandemic somewhere else. But it's not just xenophobia, right? We see an emergence of racism globally. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently talked about what he termed a tsunami of hate, and he asked for an all-out effort to end hate speech globally. And he could certainly see that it wasn't just the Chinese that are being blamed; it was the poor, it was the people of color as well. And of course, if you are poor, you don't really have the opportunity to protect yourself against the virus in the ways that you've been told to do. You can't self-isolate if you live in a favela in Brazil. You can't wash your hands if you don't have access to clean water. if you share a toilet with 200 other people. And of course, then you become more likely to be infected and to be infectious. And then you become a sign of the virus. You're not considered a victim of the virus. You're considered a part of the virus. You're part of the threat, instead of somebody that you need to care for and protect in society. And of course, that is something that energizes racism globally in many parts of the world. I mean, and we can think about this in terms of race. We can also think about this in terms of class. If you look at a nation like India, the poor, the migrant worker has been targeted. They've been sprayed with disinfectant. So obviously they're considered a walking virus, a hazard, a health hazard, rather than a group of people that is part of society and that needs protection. So how do you move towards global justice? And what kind of changes are necessary here? There's research that shows that societies with strong public health care are much more resilient at the moment, and they do a much better job resisting the spread of the virus and containing the crises that the virus have energized as well. So if that is a model for a resistant society, we need global solidarity on a systemic level, right? Solidarity that goes beyond the nation state. It doesn't need to be the dismantling of the nation state necessarily, but the recognition that we're part of one system, and that global social justice, global economic justice, global epistemological justice will help to create a globally resistant, resilient society. It's a difficult sell to a world society that's turning towards populism, which is moving in precisely the other direction. So how can you how can you help create such a drastic change in global politics, where globalization stops being an engine that locates cheap labor and natural resources in the global south and then funnels them towards the industries and corporations somewhere else, and turn reality. You can't do that without introducing new narratives, without changing the narrative that understands capitalism and neoliberal capitalism as the only system in place, as the only imaginable system for the transfer of commodities and ideas globally. So we really need to find new narratives that can break that down and help us imagine a different kind of society and a different kind of world. And I see that going on in fiction today, and I see that going on in film, and I see that going on in politics as well. I mean, one thing that's actually changing at the moment is the global conversation on social justice, on global social justice, and on the need to protect the environment as well. I think in many ways this is a rehearsal for a much greater crisis, the pandemic. We're moving towards a global environmental crisis that's going to be much bigger than what we're experiencing right now. It's going to energize the same crises again. We need a much more resilient global society to survive that particular crisis. And then we need the narratives that help us identify with a society that furthers that kind of global solidarity.
And my last question sort of follows from this, what you just said about the need for global justice and solidarity. But in a way, are we in a kind of a dual condition where it's a far cry from global solidarity? Are we in a crisis, which is a crisis of global solidarity? There is none right now, would you say?
Well, I think there is certainly there are organizations that are working towards global solidarity. They tend to be supranational, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, World Food Programme, and so on. And I think that they're really saying precisely this: we need to build global solidarity. But we can also see politicians, especially on the right wing, especially populist politicians, working against this, saying that the only solution to this crisis is to double down on nationalism. And to protect the nation state, so I think we see both processes going on at the same time. We see such strange things going on within the EU as well, where we have EU politicians talking about European solidarity and the need to support nations within Europe who've suffered greatly from the pandemic. But we also see this politicians within those same countries shutting borders and wanting to energize their own economies. And I think it's absolutely essential that we realize that the way out of these crises and this pandemic is not a competition between nation states. That's not going to work. There can only be losers there. There's no first place to be gained, even if Trump would love for that to be the case. That's not how it works. We need to recognize that we're part of a global environmental, ecological, economic system, and that we're only as resilient as, I wouldn't want to call it the weak links. I don't think that's an appropriate way of phrasing it. But I think you understand basically what that image anyway. We need to make sure that all nations have the resilience that's needed to address these problems. An example here, when Trump closed the borders at the beginning of the pandemic, he also deported a number of people, especially into South America, without any real process. But people had already been infected by the virus there, so they brought the virus to South America, where it's now spreading. That causes poverty, that causes suffering, that causes new waves of refugees who then have also been infected and who will enter US society and bring potentially another wave of the pandemic into society. Taking care of those people, creating livable conditions for them is a way to fight the pandemic for Trump, but it doesn't work within that kind of framework that he's working on. But we need to find a way, a much more hopeful way forward that doesn't put the citizen in the center, but the global citizen, so to speak, in the center instead. That's how you create a resilient world.
Thank you. On that very hopeful note, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for letting me speak today. Thank you.